I'd like to thank you all for being here. My committee, thank to everybody who's going to be watching this as a recording. I know you're me in spirit. Those of you who were at my advancement, not everything worked out quite as I intended, but I hope you won't be disappointed with the result anyway. Up the presentation by my research questions. As Sri suggested, I'll skip over some of the things that I did before the advancement. Should make it shorter. Since it's about logographic languages, writing scripts, I'll start with why that's relevant and why it's hard, and then we'll go on into the rest of it.
Let's say China.
China, China, China,
China.
China,
China.
China, 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 China,
China.
China, 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 China. I have to have my China.
All right, so it's a pretty relevant subject. There are about 25 million active Chinese as a foreign language learners, and this is not even mentioning the Japanese learners. It is one of the hardest languages to learn. Here's my next slide. Didn't crash. All right, so on the right here we have the US government assessment of how difficult it is to learn different languages. We see the category 4 languages has both Cantonese and Mandarin and Japanese, and it takes twice as long as the category 3 languages. So logograms write a written character that represents a word or a morpheme, and the morpheme is the smallest meaningful unit in the language. Right over there I have characters for the Chinese word buan. So bu is a negation particle, and then an is safety. So each one of those is a morpheme, and they make a word together. To be considered functionally literal, you need to know about 2,000 characters in each of those languages, and that's hard. And there's frequently a big divide, unlike in any other languages, for students coming from an alphabetic language trying to learn a language with a logographic script. Another thing is that this is a pretty new discipline. While like people have been trying to teach and learn English as a second language for hundreds of years, whereas Japanese, it like became popular during the 80s economic bubble, and with Chinese like after the bubble burst in the 90s. So there's only a few decades worth of like active research on this. So what's the difficulty? These are the 5,000 Hanzi, the Chinese characters that like a native speaker uses in their daily life. Do you need to know this if you want to learn Chinese? There's this guy, Chesterton. He's a writer and philosopher. I may not agree with everything he says, but he said, if a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. And I really like that. So do you need to know Hanzi if you want to learn Chinese? Not necessarily. So maybe you just want to amuse your friends or talk with your in-laws or like survive a vacation in China. Like you don't need to learn any. It's fine. Maybe you want to go a step further. You want to be able to read the menu and understand the memes and keep up with your favorite star. Do you need to learn them then? Yes and no. What you need to do is like recognize them in context, which is a lot easier than trying to write them. In case you're curious, the meme, Thor says, hey, I like your hair. And she says, I like your hair too. And then meeting a few years later. All right. So let's say you want to go another step further. You want to be able to communicate. You want to be able to send a text to your friend or an email to your boss. Do you need to learn the characters? Still, just recognition mostly will get you there because the modern input methods allow you to enter the pronunciation, and they will give you suggestions. And like modern algorithms do a pretty good job at suggesting the correct thing. There'll probably still be some typos, but for the most part, you're okay. And then like one thing about Japanese and Chinese that they use syllables rather than letters. And because of that, their a lot fewer combinations of those syllables that would make a word of a reasonable length. And there's tons and tons of homonyms, especially if you don't mind the tones. And that is why the characters are necessary for those languages. So, Chesterton said, if a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. I say, if you have time and desire, why not do it well? So you want to learn to write the characters. And at this level, you'll be able to write a sticky note or brainstorm on a whiteboard. Very important life skills. But some people want to do it. So then do you need to learn all 5,000? Not really. The Chinese proficiency test, even at the very highest level, only tests 1,850 Hanzi for handwriting ability. And like in your daily life, about 500 of the most common ones is all you need to do to know how to write. So now that I've told you that most likely you don't need to learn a lot of them, my research is for those who do want to learn. So let's continue to right, why is there that divide between literacy and spoken fluency, and what can be done about it? What is missing? Research question 1. So a little bit about kanji structure, and I'll be skipping a lot between the Chinese Hanzi and Japanese kanji because they, right, kanji came from Hanzi. So while the languages are very different, the characters themselves, like a lot of the strategies for learning to write them specifically, are similar. So I've been drawing on both fields for my research. So kanji consist of components. The components or radicals, right? Those may have a meaning of their own, and that meaning may or may not contribute to the meaning or pronunciation of the character. And then there is a stroke order. One of the most obvious things is the way that native speakers draw a square versus the way the rest of us do. And like you see in this red circle on the upper right, like because of the way they draw it, it turns into the squiggly N versus a square. So in a typed text, you can't tell the difference, but if you don't know the stroke order, that would confuse you. Traditionally, the characters are learned through just writing them a lot. And I went through it myself. It was pretty tedious, and long-term effectiveness is questionable. But it's still the common go-to. So how to make it more fun, how to make it more effective. There have been attempts to gamify the experience, but for the most part, it feels like just glorified flashcards. And right, you're just like clicking the correct answer. And two of the things that are missing in this are component awareness and production practice, which have both been linked to higher rates of literacy. Let's talk a second about endogenous and exogenous content integration. So on the left, we have the game, so to speak, and in it, you're learning Japanese by interacting with the environment and filling in the speech bubbles. So endogenous educational content integration is when the content is integrated into game in such a way that you can't take it out without fundamentally changing the game. And then exogenous is when that content is kind of slapped on. So like in the game on the right, you could easily replace those questions with math questions and the game wouldn't change. Again, research shows that endogenous integration is a lot more effective, both for teaching and keeping learners immersed. There are other examples of endogenous content integration. This is Learn Japanese to Survive, Kanji Wars. So it's very pretty, Japanese themed. The battle is still kind of click the correct answer to hit, and it has undisguised lessons. So it's kind of endogenous-ish design, but a lot of players on Steam praised it, that they finished it and retained the material, but it only has 100 characters, and trying to expand it to include the rest of them would be a lot of work. So very expensive and time consuming. So it's not scalable, and also still doesn't really have component focus, nothing about stroke order or anything. So the things that do have it are some apps. They allow drawing practice. They have like all of the details. Mnemonics, even like on the right, you see Wanikani's mnemonic for the character, right? But some of those mnemonics are problematic. Like you see theirs, it says narwhal's mouths are on the right side of their head. So it's very arbitrary. Could it be right? Could it be left? It has all this extra information for the student to memorize, like, oh, that's a narwhal, that's a mouth. But then like, is it right or left? They may not necessarily remember. So you gotta watch out for that. And then the other thing is that this is for self-motivated, and maintaining motivation to learn a language, especially one of LWS, is like a big difficulty. So something more is needed. Now we go to talk about Duolingo. They do a lot of awesome things for gamification, and these are like older screenshots. They've added more since then. One thing that they do lack is gameplay. So it's not a game. They're not claiming to be a game, but so they have a lot of motivational structures. For LWS, they still don't offer production practice, only by input of the pronunciation. So, and also Duolingo teaches the whole language, like with grammar and everything, and not just characters specifically. And right, the point that I'm trying to address is that divide between spoken and reading fluency. So a more specialized approach is needed. So this is the answer to my first research question: is we need production practice, component awareness, or we need advanced content, not just the beginning material, assistance with motivation, and endogenous design. What can be done? So half of this I'm kind of going to go through quickly because this was pre-advancement. My first project was Radical Tunes, a musical game for learning kanji. So you had to draw in time with music. And I wanted to see if the music had mnemonic effect on learning the stroke order and direction, the same way that it does on text recognition. Yes. So my pilot study had a musical version. And non-musical version was just chalk sounds. And it had 24 participants, only 6 characters. And what happened was they all did perfectly on the after test. So I couldn't assess how well the mnemonic effect worked because I am guessing that it was just too easy. Now for the experience questionnaire, the treatment group did enjoy it better. So at least the music made it more enjoyable. The limitations: the content is too easy, too few participants, unaware of long-term effects, and then the pre-recorded music sometimes made for a jarring experience because it wouldn't necessarily be tied with the people drawing. So then there is a follow-up study. This time we have 15 characters, 42 participants, and then there was a follow-up test. I don't know if Adam is there, but he helped with the procedural sound generation so that our music could be responsive to touch. And then we also did procedural melody generation so that both of the groups could have music. But like with the ABC song, the thing about mnemonic effect of music on text is that the melody has to both rhythmically match the text, and also it has to be a consistent melody. So if you were trying to learn the ABCs, but you were singing a different melody each time, it wouldn't help you. So my control group had a procedurally generated melody, so it was different each time they drew, whereas the treatment group had the same melody every time. Research questions for the follow-up is we already know it makes it more enjoyable, but does it help remembering? Here is a short video of what second version looked like.
to
There we go. All right, this time we had 42 participants, did the meaning pre-tests and then post-tests, and for writing, right? Let's just skip to the results. The measures I took were, I looked at the order and direction of the strokes. So the color here represents the order in which the strokes were drawn, and then the big dots is indicates where they started the stroke. So here are the results. They were mixed. The best or the most noticeable difference was in the kanji that had more than 8 strokes. Then most of the kanji have more than 8 strokes, and even the beginning ones, like the one for name, has 10 strokes. So it is relevant on all levels, and like the easier ones are kind of easy enough to remember anyway. So I think it's significant, and at the very least, it is makes it more pleasant. Some of the other things is that people in the music group remembered to do this little hook on the moon radical better. And then for some reason, they remembered the meaning of the kanji better than the control group. My guess is because the meaning was spoken at the end of the melody each time, that they benefited from the ABC song effect. So limitations for the follow-up is mechanical torque, reward speed, not effort. So as you can see in this illustration, like this person, despite there being an undo button and they obviously made a mistake was at last stroke, they didn't bother clicking undo and fixing it. So it's hard to assess how much they were trying. And then there were also inconsistencies in how fast they returned for the follow-up test. And finally, the melodies were perceived as too similar, which would dampen the mnemonic effect. But moving on. So I had this conversation with one of my Chinese language professors. And I was asking her what kind of mistakes the students were making. And she said that a lot of times there would be component substitution or like fixing the components, mixing the components, the position of them. So as you can see, a lot of Hanzi are similar looking. There's like difference by single stroke or even like the comparative length of the strokes. So for my next project, I wanted to try to address this problem. My second game is called Zen Hanzi, and Zen is how to in Chinese, so it's a pun. Yes. Design principles. I wanted to focus on component substitution. It's endogenous material integration because you can't take out Hanzi out of this without breaking the game. Juicy interactions, so trying to make it intrinsically pleasing to move things around. It's designed for micro leisure intervals, meaning like if you're standing in line, you could just like pull it out and click on a few things and then put it back away. And then we will talk about scalability later, but that was another consideration. So how the game works is you see on the scroll here is the pronunciation in pinyin and the English meaning, and the player has to pick the correct frame and then drag and drop the correct components into the correct slots. Clicking on the hint will show them the character, and then they also get the feedback about how well they did. It was color-coded. It turned out that people who don't play a lot of games, like for them, color coding is not self-evident. And also it wouldn't work for colorblind people. So this all needs to be addressed in the future. To evaluate Zen Hanzi, I wanted to do a comparison study, but there aren't any games like it. This is the reason I made it. So I decided to go with Quizlet, which is frequently used by first-year Chinese professors to assign Hanzi homework for their students. So again, Quizlet, not the best comparison, but the best I could figure out. A little about Quizlet. It's a flashcard app. This is like a typical flashcard there. Quizlet has built-in sound databases, so the pronunciation is included. And students and teachers can make their own decks. It has two game modes. One is like matching, and the other one is the asteroid. Type in the correct answer to avoid the rock hitting the planet. I had three hypotheses that Zenhanzi users will do better on the component awareness test, that it will not negatively affect their recognition, like meaning scores, and that Zenhanzi is more enjoyable than Quizlet. So spoiler alert, the first two were confirmed and the last one not so much. Study setup, so we had 2 apps, Zenhanzi, 10 minutes for studying, 63 participants. This time the participants were recruited through language learner forums. So it's a little better than Mechanical Turk, but still not quite the target audience. Now, I picked those Hanze because of their complexity and the variety of structures. And they're all first-year characters. Procedure, I used Qualtrics to collect the data, so it can be a little confusing. So we started with a Qualtrics tutorial, demographics survey, pre-test, post-tests. There were two tutorials, both for Zenhanzi and for Quizlet, for each respective group, so that they knew what they were using. 10 minutes was from, I asked around, and that's how long people said it takes them usually to learn new characters. It was not enough for some people, but that's what it is. And then there was an experience survey. So results. As you can see on the component post-test, the treatment group did a lot better. It's a large effect size. And it didn't, there was no statistically significant difference for the meaning post-test. So they still learned to recognize the Hanze, but also they learned the components. So what happened with the enjoyment? For the most part, the scores are equalish. There's only 2 statistically significant differences, is that the Zenhanzi users found it slightly more novel than Quizlet users found their app. And another one is that Zenhanzi users reported feeling less confident using the game. And that's like feeling incompetent is a negative thing, right? So that would affect your enjoyment of a product. And my guess is that right, it's harder to learn all of the components instead of just like recognizing the Hanze. So they were making more mistakes. So even though they learned more, they felt less competent. And that is certainly something to consider when designing these games. Next question, what about scalability? Now, why is it important? Because of this. Imagine by hand deciding which frames to put and which components to put down here for each of those 5,000 characters, or like deciding where the dots go on this one for Radical Tunes. So for Radical Tunes, I used an open source database called Kanji. It has SVG files for all of the kanji. It has the stroke order and direction information. So I was able to use that to create my app. So it's already there. A lot of the other information like meaning and stuff can be scraped. So for that one, I didn't have to do too much. But for Zenhanzi, I had to get creative. I made 2 databases. I made proof of concept databases. So on the left, we have a way to record the structure of the Hanze and so the components and where they go. And then on the right, we have a list of components with a list of lookalike components, because let me just click back for a second. In the components on the bottom here, I tried to, first of all, for sure, include the correct components, but also to include components that look like the correct components, but are slightly different. So this database allows me to do that automatically. On the bottom right here, you see the example of what I consider lookalike components. And then you see the scary names and numbers. So I used Fordham's 800 most common simplified Chinese components as a base, but there were some problems with it, so I had to modify it. First of all, upper left, you see the water radical. It looks different in different Hanze, but by all the component databases I've been able to find, still treat it as the same component. But it would be wrong to not include the little hook in the eternal, and it would be wrong to put it in the water. So it's a important difference, and I wanted my game to be able to capture that. So I couldn't use the existing databases. Same with the abandoned and nation, like it's straight when it's by itself. It has a swoop when it's not by itself. And then on the right are more examples of Fordham's list. Like number 62 is too complex, like you can break it up further. Number 131 has the top, but the bottom wasn't a component in this list, so I had to make it by myself. And finally, number 94, like a lot of beginners will draw that second stroke all the way across. So that's not a real component at all, but it's a common mistake, so I wanted it included in my game. So I had to augment the database. Finally, bottom left here, you see the traditional way of breaking up. Hanze is less granular than I would like, because right, it would be broken, the road would be broken into foot and name, but each of those could be further broken, and like each one of those could be a potential for a substitution mistake. And also, if you look at the bottom of the foot radical here, the look of it changes. It becomes a swoopy thing inside of the foot kanji, whereas it's angular inside road and by itself. So that swoopy thing is also important, but breaking it up this way would confuse students. That is why it is important. And then again, going back to the Hanze database, a lot of this information can be scraped from the internet, but like my unique list of components and unique way of breaking up Hanze requires for this to be created by hand, like some of those parts. So that's several thousand characters, or however many, that would have to be written by hand. But after that, they could be reused for so many different purposes. Now, can it be reused for other logographic scripts? Yes and no. It can definitely be used to bootstrap the other databases, but here, these three characters all mean iron. In the three different scripts, you see like there's similarities, but there's definitely differences. So there would need to be a separate database for each one. Okay, what else is there? Research question 4. This is, we're getting to the theoretical part. I didn't get to make studies about this, but I want to share my ideas. In the 60s, these guys noticed that kids were glued to the TV, and they wanted to do something good with that addictive power of TV. So they made Sesame Street, which became an international phenomenon. And like these days, kids are glued to tablets, so can we do something about it? To talk about it, I like to use Yukai Cho's Octalysis framework. He talks about white hat and black hat motivation techniques. So white hat ones make you feel good about yourself, like they're positive, right? And the bad ones are things that make you feel frustrated, like you keep coming back because you're frustrated or you're impatient. So 2, I wanted to specifically look closer. There is gacha or loot boxes. And it's basically anything that like there's a reward, but you're not sure what it is. Right, there was a lot of controversy about loot boxes, and why it's so powerful is because it uses a varying rate reward, right? Same as like if you're training a dog, if you give her a treat every time she sits, like you stop giving the treats, she stops sitting. But if you give the treat every once in a while, she'll keep sitting down because she's hoping like, oh, this time I'm gonna get a treat for sure. And that's how people get addicted to gambling. And loot boxes are similar in that way. That's why they've been outlawed, like in some forms, but it's powerful and is still used in a lot of games. And then the other one is the Zeigarnik effect, the unfinished business effect. I want to tell you about where it came from, but time is short. So games, there are some games that have like long quest logs, and every time like you're almost done with one quest, there's another one that's almost done. So you'll be like, as soon as I turn in this quest, I'm going to quit for the day. But then you're like, oh, it's just going to take me 2 minutes to finish this other one. And then there's idle-ish games that have like, right, you're not actively completing a quest, but there's a bunch of timers that are counting down. So you're always like, oh, I just gotta wait for 2 minutes and then I can collect this reward and like start the next quest. So I wanted to use some of those things. And so what makes a free-to-play mobile game successful? There's been studies, but their results are contradictory. But there are two different areas of the game that require different strategies. The first one is the core loop. It's like needs to be short, needs to be enjoyable, but usually not enough to maintain a player's interest in the long run. And then there is a retention game that makes the player keep coming back. I am going to skip over this slide a little bit. Okay, so why the studies failed to identify the success, what would bring success to a game, is the way the studies have been largely done is they look at the top performing games in like Play Store, but that makes it susceptible to survivorship bias, right? The World War II, they looked at the planes that came back, right? And they saw the parts where they were shot and tried to reinforce those. But actually, it's the parts that were whole and the ones that came back. Like those were the ones that needed to be protected. So studying successful games doesn't tell us what made them successful. It just tells us what is allowed to be there without preventing the success. So Legner made his study, instead of trying to identify common features, he just like looked at specific features and tried to figure out the psychological basis for why they were effective. So I want to kind of follow in that line of looking at games and looking at the specific features and talking about how they could be applied to an educational game. The first game I wanted to talk about is The Walking Dead. It's right, you walk around in the real world to interact with objects, a first-person shooter. Once you have an encounter, and there's like cards are a power-up reward. What stood out the most for me is the clan structure. So there's up to 25 people, and they get these like clan challenge boards. I'm gonna really condense this part. So the tasks are like kill 300 walkers with Abram, or like blow up 10 zombies with a grenade. And like the further you go, like, you know, it's blow up 200 zombies with a grenade, which is hard to do, I'll tell you. But you have teams and they're working together. And at any point you can see how much, like who is the top contributor to any one challenge. And they have a team chat where they can coordinate their efforts and encourage each other. And then because it's like a 5x5 grid, and once the challenge is complete, like the player that performed the most, their name and the avatar are on the board. So it really plays into this both peer pressure and the sense of accomplishment. But at the same time, right, you're playing together, so you're not really competing. But active players would make like a fun competition of it, trying to get their name on it as much as possible, or like get a bingo by putting 5 in a row. And also, like every week, your progress would be reset to the beginning of the board. So the last like day or two of the week, like teams would often make a strong effort to try and finish the board. Another element is the periodic quests. So it had daily and weekly quests, and also various items around you respawn every so often. So this is a way to encourage the player to keep coming back at least once a week, right? Because the weekly missions had pretty good rewards. And then not only does it bring the players back, but it also, because there is a variety of them, it keeps the player aware of all the mechanics, like not letting them forget about all that. How can we apply it to educational games? So I think Duolingo, for example, could really benefit from having clans. Like recently they've added like friend quests, but I have yet to understand how that exactly works, but it will be like the two of you together need to do 20 lessons. And like that's great, but like, there could be so much more. And if we're talking about a Hansa learning game, for example, then the tasks could be like unlock 20 new Hansa with 10 or more strokes, or complete 200 reviews with perfect score, that sort of thing. And then, right, the peer pressure, the black hat motivational, or like just the social encouragement and sense of accomplishment, right, could all be added through this clan system. Now, Walking Dead also had the low-key competitive effect, and that is the intra-clan challenge board. So you don't really get any rewards for topping that leaderboard, but like some people really got into it. So it is a motivator for people who are competitive. All right, next game. Cat game, the cat collector. It's called the cat game for real. This one is an idle-ish game. There is no core loop really. You're just like, you have these cats, you feed them, they bring you baskets, you have to wait before you open the basket, and then like there is either a new cat in there or some crafting materials. You craft materials into like fancier materials so that you can build like furniture for your cats. And at first, things take like several seconds or several minutes, but as your collection goes on, it can take hours. And so the way this maps to language learning is that there's a spaced repetition system where it's been shown that if you review something right before you forget it, you remember it longer, rather than like sitting for an hour and trying to learn the same thing over and over. So this would do a good job of pacing, because like first you have to review it in an hour, but the next time in 3 hours, and then like in a week. So this kind of escalation of wait times is good. And right, this plays on the Zeigarnik effect of like you always have some basket almost ready to collect, or a craft. But say you have a basket that will be ready in 2 minutes, but there is no core loop in this game. So what do? For this, they have supplemental activities. Now they have contests where you use your cats and items to try and meet the theme of the contest as best as you can, and then you can also judge it. And then there is mini games, and this like mini game thing is in several idle-ish games that I've seen. And the common feature is that one game is like quick hand-eye coordination, and the other one is like a slow at your own pace puzzle. So here we have poppy cats. You have to like connect the cats of the same color really fast. Like there's a timer at the bottom here. And then the blocky cats, you like at your pace, drag and drop the figures onto the field. And here's the dungeon cats, dungeon dogs and castle cats. Like they also have like the memory game on the left is a quick one, and then the bejeweled clone is a slow one. So for an educational game, I say that my radical teams and Den Hanse map fairly well onto those mini game mechanics. And then for contests, for example, in language learning, right, you could try to translate the proverb to the best of your language ability, and then have other students of that same language judge you, or write award points. Also similar to the cats, right, there could be areas of related words, and then you could have a premium area with more rare words, like maybe like festival related ones. So it would be like limited time content that is could trigger fear of missing out, right? All those bad things that motivate you to do things. And so in the cat game, let me just go back for a second. Right, on the right here, we have the premium area with really fancy cats, and either you get them during an event, or you can unlock them also through a lot of extra work. All right. So we've talked about all that. Now, is it ethical? I tried to submit this work, and like one of the reviewers was just like angry, like, this is evil. So the big problem was like loot boxes, right? And Zeigarnik effect is that they're trying to trap the player, take their time, make them watch ads, make them pay money. And so it's not in the player's best interest. Now, if we're trying to use it not to get the money out of the player, but to get them to learn more, is this still evil? Like, I think that the most problematic part of it is not there anymore, but it's a discussion we should have as an educational game community. One thing, though, is that it has been shown that exposing children to that kind of stuff is bad for them. So even though the commercial game makers don't have any hesitation to keep using it in kids' games, I think as academics, like, I would not feel right trying to run these experiments with kids, but I think we should definitely try with the adults. There's like a lot to be gained, I think, there. Briefly, contributions are some evidence of music's mnemonic effect for LWS stroke knowledge acquisition. Then I have the two novel and scalable mini game designs and the conceptualizing engagement and retention mechanics that are evil for good. Future work. There are a couple projects. I think completing those databases would be very valuable for the LWS software creating individuals. Then it would be really nice to have a comparative study of different versions of an educational game with different engagement mechanics. So Alexandrovsky did this for a pleasure game, like, so something like that, but for an educational game would be great to do. And finally, both of my, well, all three of my studies with Dan Hansen and Radical Tunes were with target population. So doing a longitudinal one with target population, like to really assess their enjoyability and efficacy in long term would be great. And these are my cats. That is all. Questions?